Welcome, everyone. It's really great to see you all here, to see so many faces, familiar, new faces. This for us is a new venue for this seminar series. So we're happy that you're here with us to try it out. This is the Insights for Action seminar series. Across the series, we focus on how researchers and practitioners within Oxford and beyond Oxford are using research insights for action. And today we're here to talk about Professor Akshay Mangla's new book, Making Bureaucracy Work, Norms, Education, and Public Service Delivery in Rural India. You can see it up here. We've got lots of copies on the table, and you'll hear all about it. And so I'm joined by Akshay, who is Associate Professor in International Business here at Saïd Business School, and the author of the book, also by Daniel Armanios, who is BT Professor of Major Program Management at the school, and by Khadijah Fancy, who's the Principal Education Advisor at Cambridge Education, which is an education, gender, and social inclusion specialist organization. We're going to talk about the book. We're going to talk about the insights in this particular context that Akshay studied of education across rural India. And we're also going to talk about the implications for many other contexts as well. In conversation, there'll also be a chance for you all to ask questions and engage. And also those of you joining online to ask questions and engage. And I'll find Jessica and have her flag those questions. Great. For us when we get to that part of the conversation. But I want to start, Akshay, by just asking you to tell us a bit about the book. Why did you write it? And what are the key messages?
Great. Thank you, Marya. And I really appreciate everyone being here for this event. And thank you for organizing this, everyone at the School Center. And Daniel and Khadijah, thank you for being here and engaging with the book. So this book has a long gestation. And why did I write it? Well, let me begin by saying that I didn't plan to write this book. I didn't plan to write a book about the state. So I was looking at child labor interventions in India, and these were mainly non-governmental. So NGOs, private firms, working at the local level to manage supply chains and prevent child labor. Now, as I did fieldwork and I dug in, more and more I found that actually the local level officials, NGO field workers, school teachers would bring up the role of the state. And in fact, in a lot of their work, they hit this brick wall where they needed to find ways to coordinate with public administration. And so all this effort to infuse resources through the private sector and through the NGO sector reached this limiting factor, which was the state. And so this got me thinking, well, what could be the state's role in education and in service delivery? And as I kind of dug in further, I found that actually when I talked to parents and I talked to school teachers, their narratives and experiences about the state were very different. The state is not the same thing to everybody. Now you might say, well, this is obvious. India is a gigantic place. It's a large federation and there's huge diversities across it. So surely there's going to be differences across it. But when I began to look at the literature on implementation, I found that it was actually quite thin on understanding these variations, right? So there's a lot written on differences in terms of funding. So how much resources are being put in to education or health or other social sectors. But the translation of those resources into concrete outcomes, that process I found was being under-theorized or wasn't sufficiently understood to understand the varying patterns that I was observing. So what did I do? What is the book about, essentially, right? What I began to do when I first started my fieldwork in India was try to identify states where I could do these comparisons in a careful way. So I decided to look at a subset of states. 4 states are covered in the book. You might say that's small, but actually they have a population about the size of Europe, if you add them up. So these are sizable impacts on children in the world. So having matched these states in careful ways so I could control for a whole host of factors, right? So I have the same national programs for universal primary education across these states, the same formal institutions, so the same design of bureaucracy, the same incentives within the bureaucracy, yet you see varying patterns and varying outcomes for education. So what do I find, right? What are the messages? A couple of things. One, bureaucracy is not the same thing in every place. That you can have the same formal institutions, you can have the same formal incentives, and you can even have similarly resource bureaucracies, and yet how they understand their mandates and carry them out can be very different. And the reason that I find is that the norms that guide bureaucratic behavior can vary. And these norms, I refer to bureaucratic norms in the book, they're basically maps on how is it that I should understand my mandate, what is it my role and my responsibilities as a bureaucrat, and how do I interpret public policy? And then in turn, how do I relate to non-state actors in the process of interpreting that policy? So let me walk you through the argument a bit. So in the book, I actually find two distinct forms of bureaucracy. One, which I theorize is legalistic, and the other is deliberative. And a legalistic bureaucracy, I think many of us are familiar with. It's the bureaucracy that's impersonal, that's really about following the rules, ensuring compliance with the rules, maintaining hierarchy and boundaries between the state and society. A deliberative bureaucracy is much more mobilized by participation, encouraging discussion and decision-making across hierarchies, enabling some interpretation in a more flexible manner of those rules. And what I find in the book is essentially the deliberative bureaucracy is much more effective in delivering high-quality education services. And the reason being is that these bureaucracies are much better able to adapt the policies to the varying local needs of different communities. So you can take the same policy, and a deliberative bureaucracy will actually find ways of really altering that program or policy to different socio-cultural and geographic contexts. Whereas the legalistic bureaucracy is very good at compliance, following the rules, and you get school buildings built, but you don't get quality education services because they're not able to adapt those services to varying local needs. So that's a big, you could say, finding in the book. If I'm not stretched for time, I have one more finding I thought I would point out. So the book is about education and bureaucracy, but I think the second message I want to, I'd like to put forward is that norms don't just occur inside an organization, because organizations have to work with society to deliver public services. So services are often co-produced. You need society to participate. In fact, children in a classroom are co-producing education with their teachers just by being there and being disciplined and sitting in their seats. And when they don't do that, they might be disrupting the education process. So we have to recognize society's role. And what I find in the book is actually, or what I demonstrate in the book, is that these norms not only impact how bureaucrats think, but also how citizens relate to the state. So a citizen will approach a bureaucrat and learn over time what it is that the state is going to do or not do on their behalf. So I look at different patterns of local level collective action around education. I focus on women's associations at the village level in India, and find that actually these different bureaucracies have very different ways in relating to these groups. As a consequence, these groups end up seeing the state very differently and may behave very differently in terms of the support they give to education in their own villages.
Okay, thank you. So I want to turn to Khadijah, but first I just want to underscore, because we're mostly going to focus on sort of the implications of this, how the insights from the book play out in practice in different contexts. But for those of you who are academics and researchers here, I want to really highlight the excellent thought, the research design, and the theorizing that's in the book. And so those of you who haven't had a chance to read it, I would encourage you to take a look at it from a research design and theory development perspective. It's really a masterpiece in that regard.
Thank you.
And I think it also has interesting practical implications. And that brings us to you, Khadijah. Tell us about how the ideas of different kinds of bureaucratic norms resonate with your own work on strengthening education systems.
Thanks. First of all, thanks, Akshay. It was a fascinating read. I won't pretend I read the whole thing. I did read what you told me to read, the chapters that you thought would resonate, and I will promise to read the rest of it at some point. So what Cambridge Education does is deliver large-scale education programs, FCDO, USAID, World Bank, UN-funded programs. So as an example, we work in Uganda on a program that worked, this is my colleague sitting in the audience, worked in every school in Uganda. We work in Sierra Leone, in every school in Sierra Leone. We work in Tanzania and South Sudan, and we've worked in a number of different countries, not just in sub-Saharan Africa. And so scale, system are our bread and butter. But at the end of the day, it is this boundary that you talk about, this space where the citizen comes in contact with the system, that is where the meat of the work takes place. So one of the things we talk about in our work is that process of translating policy into processes, into behaviors. That's good governance. That's UNDP definition of good governance, right? Is when you get that link through. So policies, processes, and people. And as you rightly say, it is the people in and outside, quote unquote, the system that we need to figure out how to get to link up. So a couple of the things that came to mind as I was reading the book that really resonate with the ways that we work are the challenges of that relationship, the power dynamics, the issues of accountability, how participation is complicated by those two things. So one of the things that we deal with, and as Marya mentioned, when you're talking about gender, when you're talking about marginalization, when you're talking about girls' education or education of children with disabilities, you're talking about groups that are historically and traditionally and in their societies silenced and marginalized. Their needs are not understood, they're not assessed. And so making sure that those needs are then understood in the classroom and met in the classroom has extra challenges associated with it. So this issue of tackling behaviors and bureaucratic norms, as you call them, or the sort of people factor, right, is a really difficult part of the work, because I think one of the things that we fall back on is technocratic solutions to really complicated problems. And technocratic solutions are really important. You need to learn how to train a teacher. You need to learn how to run a classroom. There are technocratic solutions there, but they are always mediated by the person. And if that teacher has negative attitudes towards girls or towards children with disabilities or towards certain groups that they're working in. So if you have a teacher from a rural, from an urban area teaching in a rural area, the attitudes and preconceptions that they might bring with them affect how they work. Similarly, if you have a parent who is non-literate, has not engaged with the education system themselves as a child, negotiating for their child is a very difficult thing. So one of the things we do is really break down this notion of the skills that people need. So the skill that a teacher needs is not just the technocratic skill of delivering the pedagogical skills, delivering a curriculum, but he or she also needs the skills of understanding the children in the classroom, understanding the community, listening to the community, and being willing to be held to account. So that complexity there really sort of challenges us on a day-to-day basis, and you pick up on all of that in the book. And we approach it in lots of different ways, which we'll talk about at different points, through use of evidence, through use of different training, through iterative practices and ways of working with different actors in the sector. But I think that boundary is firm and shouldn't be firm. That boundary between who is the citizen and who is the system actor is too firm. It's too deeply drawn, and we need to break that apart.
Thank you. Just to ask you to respond a little bit, if I'm understanding your argument and what Khadijah's saying, it sounds like the deliberative approach is very much breaking that apart, and it's through this feedback mechanism with input and involvement and perhaps some sensing, to use one of Daniel's terms that we might hear about later, that the bureaucratic side learns and engages and adapts.
Yeah, I think this definitely picks up on the piece of my argument, which is societal feedback in implementation. So I look at the process of implementation, and there's a tendency to think that services are just delivered in a top-down fashion, but actually going back to what I said about co-production, you need that feedback from society. And the part of society that Khadijah mentioned are the least advantaged, which is what this book is about, actually. And to get that group involved in policy implementation processes, what deliberation does is it provides a platform for them to communicate their needs, their interests, and as a consequence, they gain capabilities to participate. And that capability building is not just inside the state, it's within the communities that monitor and manage schools. And so certainly I think, in my view, from my observations, at least in India, that process of deliberation can enable that larger, you could say, a process of breaking down that barrier between state and society, which is a very challenging one. It doesn't disappear, and perhaps it ought not to, but certainly it's more effectively overcome in the case of deliberative bureaucracy.
Okay, thank you. I want to turn the conversation a little bit more to focus on bureaucracy and how the book helps us rethink bureaucracy, the nature of bureaucracy, its implications.
Yeah, so bureaucracy is in the title, so hopefully I can say something about that. When we think about bureaucracy, I mean, what comes to mind? It's a derivation from the word bureau, right? A set of drawers that are on rails, that are basically set and fixed and rigid. And what's the notion of that bureau? Well, that bureau should be impartial, impersonal. The movement from the bottom rung of the bureau to the top ought to be meritocratic, right? There needs to be civil service protection, so those rails, the drawers don't get pulled off the rails by societal actors, right? So this notion of bureaucracy as being an autonomous, impersonal, impartial agency, and we owe a lot of credit to Max Weber for providing us with that model of bureaucracy. Now, I don't think this book overturns that thinking. I think there's something really important about imagining bureaucracy in that way. What I want to push on, though, in the book is that we've tended to focus on the formal structures, the rails, the platform and the drawers, and we've lost attention to the software inside the system, which are the people, and how is it that they make sense of their roles and responsibilities. And Max Weber was aware of this, the esprit de corps, the ethos of the bureaucracy, and there's a tendency to think quite often, and I think one sees this especially in international development, that you're going to take the formal structures of bureaucracy and transplant them somewhere else. And I think that's a very big mistake, as we've seen in international development throughout history. The effort to just take formal structures and transplant them can spell disaster, because you're ignoring the informal norms, the socio-political context, and so on. So one shift that I would like to make an emphasis, at least in the study of bureaucracy, is let's again draw on Max Weber. We can return to Weber, but recognize that even Weber was aware that a bureaucracy also needs to have an ethos, and that ethos is not simply a derivative of formal structure. And this is the other part of the argument, which is that bureaucratic norms have to not only emerge, but they need to be maintained over time. And to do that, it's not just about having the good leader at the top, but you need the frontline street level bureaucrat to be committed to those norms as well. So we see a divide not just between state and society, but also inside the state. And so I try to decompose that state and recognize it's not a unitary actor. We have to see that those rails actually, if they work as rails, maybe they're not speaking to each other, and that communication needs to be encouraged, and that's where a deliberative bureaucracy can be more effective. And then lastly, I think going back to this notion of porousness, and here I might depart from Max Weber, where Max Weber, I think, is very much worried about corruption, patrimonialism, where you would get societal incursions on the state. But if you look at a service like education, how could you but want society's involvement? There's no way an education system works strictly by the state delivering it. You need society to participate in the process. And so what I try to do in the book is also recognize that we should think about bureaucracy not independent of the tasks it has to perform. So if education is the task, and education is a complex process requiring a give and take, and I think we've all had a great teacher in our lives, or I hope we've all had one that inspired us. And what did that teacher do? Probably didn't just follow the rule book. Often that teacher went above and beyond the rules, often didn't do just what was prescribed in her formal contract, but reinterpreted her role in relationship to a mission of teaching. And so if we think about getting that kind of motivation, simply following the rules, simply getting the incentives right is not enough. We have to think about how do we encourage that extra effort, and especially to reach the least advantaged, right? You have to often challenge the rules, and it can be a messy process. It's full of conflict. And the book is not a book about everyone singing together to the same choral tune in a deliberation. Very different views come out. It's conflictual, but through that conflict, you can hopefully arrive at more inclusive forms of implementation.
Okay, thank you. So Daniel, I want to turn to you. And the sort of pivot here is to think about these ideas and insights about bureaucracy and the importance of implementation and flexibility and dialogue, which Akshay has developed in a very particular context, and ask you to reflect on how those notions of bureaucracy and what makes it work and work well resonate with the context that you've studied, in particular your work on major program management.
Yeah, sure. Thanks for having me. And Akshay, truly, I think we're resonating. This is really a tour de force. It's a really exceptional book. And I'll talk about, I think I'll start with the practitioner focus, let's say, and then think about what this also has in terms of thinking how you try to develop this kind of work as a researcher. But I'll start with, I think what was interesting for me is, at the end of the day, this is, you could think of the bureaucrat as like a major program manager. They have to deploy this on a whole series of schools. They have to deploy this on a whole, it could be even beyond education. They have to develop an entire, water system with piping and the like. You can think of it similarly that way. And I think in the major program world, so to situate what I mean by major programs, they're usually very large. Usually they have implications of the order of billions of pounds. They usually impact quite a few people. We're talking about millions of folks. And the kind of interdependencies around all the different stakeholders that have to be managed, not just this government official, but in your case it was teachers, parents, even local other councils. Those kind of things, what we're supposed to put into this, how long it takes, what comes out are all unclear. Okay. And so what this made me think of is that in the space of major program management, they've thought about these things, but they haven't had this kind of trend analysis to understand the analytical tools to it. So, there's been instances of what these tactics could be, but not with this kind of analytical lens, which I thought was really interesting. And in particular, it made me think of the following tension that's kind of historic, known in major programs, which is you need to deliver the program or the project. At the same time, and you're assessed on, how long it takes, the cost and quality. They call it the iron triangle: time, cost, quality. At the same time, you have to deliver benefits. So it's not about the project itself, it's what it's going to achieve. And it seems like as a bureaucrat running this, they have kind of a tension. Do I make the benefits kind of in the service of delivery, which would be to me more of a legalistic approach, which is how do I get people to comply to my development pathway, my delivery timeline? I need this time to happen, this cost. How do I get the community to just check the box and say, okay? Versus do I make the delivery and service of the benefits, which seems to be much more of a deliberative process, which is how do we engage, negotiate through it, recognizing that we may have to adapt and tweak how we think of delivery. So I thought this was a really interesting tension of how to handle it. And to give an example, just because it's fresh, I was recently speaking with, someone who's running essentially a major welfare program for a country, and basically said that it forced them to be what they said relentlessly user focused. Because if they couldn't get what the kind of problems were from the beginning, it didn't help them understand the outcomes. And a subtle point you made in the book, I can't remember what page it was, but I think it was around in the middle of chapter 2, was that the norms is relentlessly also focused on the means. It's not necessarily the ends. And you mentioned that it's not outcome driven. It's how are we going to develop something where, the outcomes may vary depending on who comes into the play. So that's kind of the practitioner side. I think this tension between delivery and benefits, but it also starts making me think of kind of different provocations that could be quite interesting to follow on. One is, and to tie to sensing issues, is the issue of psychological safety for people doing this. Now, the reason why is that you're often dealing, when you're a bureaucrat running these kind of major programs, at best, you're dealing with discrepant information. At worst, you're dealing with a tremendous amount of trauma, because there's been historical mistrust in those areas. The government hasn't been there to support. And how do you preserve your ability to take a barrage of conflict and use it and harness it productively into channeling problems? And that's not really easy. In fact, some of the projects, I won't mention names, they literally, it's so hard and bad. They have a trauma specialist with the team to address how often they are triggered on onsite. So it brings up interesting psychological realms. If this is the work that has to be done, how do you prepare your resilience emotionally to handle it? And then I'll make 2 points if I have time. Do I have enough time? Perfect. The other one is thinking about kind of, there's been real tension right now in the politicization of bureaucracies. It's going deeper and deeper into the channels of a government. And one of the challenges, if you think of the politicization, ideally, if you're having a political agenda, you want everyone to kind of very closely adapt to the platform that's being taken on. And so it's bounding the room for discretion. And I think in some senses, the politicization, instead of making a legalistic approach and a deliberate approach in parallel, it's now sequencing them. And so it's kind of encroaching on the terrain that you can to get deliberation. And so how would a major program manager that's a bureaucrat handle that dilemma? And then the final point I'll say is that also there's been a lot of headcount and fiscal pressures. Oh, do this deliberation, but now you had 10 people, now you get 3, right? So is there ways to think about how this can be productively externalized to get the community to help you evolve with it while recognizing there's a lot more fiscal pressure and constraint for you to deliver the same kinds of things. And I'll leave it at that. We could talk about the researcher impacts later because I know we're out of time, but just this tension between delivering benefits and how it's negotiated, give me a really nice language to think through. So really appreciate this, actually. It's great.
Thank you.
Thank you. And Daniel, I just want to call out how you've really brought this to what does it mean for the individual who's sort of at the really front lines delivering this and trying to operate in a more deliberative mode. It's not easy. And it's especially not easy when there's more intense cost pressures. And you talk already about the sort of challenges from an efficiency perspective, right? Involving more voices and dealing with that conflict. I want to ask you kind of a similar question, Khadijah, about how this notion of bureaucratic norms and deliberative approaches in particular resonate with your work, where you see that playing out in the system strengthening work that you do with governments, but also with other kinds of organizations.
I mean, I think there's something so interesting about the tensions that you're talking about, because while, of course, the deliberative approach is the goal, the resource constraints, but also the capacity constraints, right? We work in schools where the teachers aren't paid, the teachers aren't trained, they have no books, they have serious constraints that they're facing. And if you want that teacher to deliver something of value so that that child comes out with some learning, because the reality is in the world that we're living in, children can be in school for years and still come out without any learning. So the learning crisis is not just about an out of school child crisis, it's about an in-school child crisis. So you have a real failure at that point of delivery, right? And so while we want to be deliberative, we want to have teachers who are creative and responsive, we also have to recognize that we need teachers who deliver. So we do end up having programs where we fall back on scripted lessons and really strict curricula. You have to deliver this on this day and this on this day. And we know that we see results as a result of that. And that's dispiriting in some ways, because those are a certain kind of result. You know, every child can learn to read to a certain level if they're taught in that way, but they will not learn to be a critical thinker. They will not learn the higher level, higher order skills that you want them to learn, and neither will the teachers. And there's an inherent tension there about how much of a box do you put a teacher in so that something happens in that classroom. And how much do you remove that box so that something transformational can happen in that classroom? That is a constant tension. And one of the things that we are grappling with is, where does the relationship between the community and the teacher, between the child and the teacher, between the teacher and the head teacher, the teachers with other teachers, the school and the local administration, the local education office, all of these relationships have space where things can go wrong. And I think one of the things that I mentioned earlier was the power issue, and the power dynamics running through those relationships are really challenging. And at the bottom of that power dynamic in terms of in the system is often the teacher, when you'd really wish for that to be reversed. You'd really wish for the teacher, who is the frontline delivery person, who really understands or should understand the children in her classroom, and have the power to influence the system, to be able to say to the system, this is what the children need. But that's not the reality in which we're working. So when it comes to a real delivery situation, we can design great programs that look at transformational outcomes, that really understand this issue of policies translated into processes, translated into something people can use. We end up with these series of constraints that bedevil that. And how do we get around that? And I think one of the things that we find as a solution to that is to really iterate, really go back over and over and over and over again, and look for champions, and look for the bright lights within that, and look for other ways of delivering. And I think, just as the last thing I'll say, that technocratic solution, sometimes you need to look at it in terms of what are the skills that a teacher needs. And what are we doing to build those other softer skills or take advantage of that knowledge that that teacher already has, the local understanding of children, things like that, so that you're leaning into those skills as well to complement. So, I mean, in terms of actual delivery in the classroom, in the complex settings in which we work, those constraints all come down to a point, right, in that relationship between the teacher and the pupil.
Okay, thank you. I want to pick up on this point, because as I'm hearing you talk, and also Daniel, your comments, it's very clear how much this is a time-intensive, context-dependent, sort of very, very localized. And it brings us to the question of scale and how might these kinds of deliberative approaches scale? What does scale mean? Is that the right word or concept to be thinking about here? And Akshay, I just want to start this part of the conversation with you. Tell us how you think about the lessons of the book for understanding scale and the possibilities for scaling and scaling equitably.
Yeah, so on context, I should just say, so this is a book about India, within India, northern India. So I think context is extremely important. In fact, it's the decontextualization of institutions and organizations that has actually led to so much trouble in many parts of the world, that we can just take something independent of its context and we don't need to know much about the informal norms, the society, the politics, and the culture, and just transplant it. So I think context matters. But in this book, I try to think about ways that the theory can travel and how can we think about scale more broadly. And, you know, one way of thinking about scale, I think the most common way thinking about scale is it's an economistic thinking about scale, where you're trying to achieve economies of scale. So you're building a Ford Model T, which is a uniform product that's aimed at everyone, and you want to reduce your cost as much as possible. It's on an assembly line. You just want to get efficiencies on that line and scale out the product economically. Now, that model might work well if what education were about is building school buildings. If all you were doing were constructing buildings, then perhaps that model of scale would work, and a legalistic bureaucracy that's focused on compliance would probably do a pretty good job. And in fact, it does a very good job. I show that in the case of Uttar Pradesh, India's largest state, more than 200 million people, went from having very, very low levels of enrollment and low coverage of schools to virtually universal enrollment at this point. School buildings were built. But if education means more than just buildings, if what happens in those buildings matter to us, a legalistic system, as I observed in the case of Uttar Pradesh, actually doesn't do very well. And here I think the economies of scale, or the economics of scale, needs to be complemented with a politics of scale. And what I mean by that is that we actually have to think about the political decisions and the variations in power, and particularly if you want to scale equitably. And I think equity is an important part of scale because there's huge diversities. I mean, India is very diverse. You go to any district in India, you'll find diversity. Oxford is a very diverse place for that matter. And so in that sense, when we think about how do you scale up education across neighborhoods within Oxford or across a district in India, one has to think about the power dynamics, which groups have a say, which groups might get lost. And I think one, solution that often comes up where I think the power dynamics are ignored is in technocratic solutions. EdTech is very big in India. It's a booming sector. And I think it's an important thing that, we're now finding ways to reach those who've not been reached using technology. But it's important to recognize that actually access is uneven, right? So something like 30% of rural households with school-going children don't have a smartphone in rural India. Right, so of those that do, let's remember there's inequalities within the household. Girls might not get access to that smartphone. Younger children have less access than older children. So even if I had a solution that had economies of scale, I would still need to think about the power dynamics of, and I'm just talking access. I'm not talking about whether or not the education software and the programs developed are actually addressing the different learning levels and needs, and say language differences and many other differences. So if we bring in a perspective of power and politics into the scale argument, I think what this book offers is a way of thinking about the type of organization and management that could enable us to actually address that politics. So deliberation is not just about getting people to talk, but ensuring there's a diversity of viewpoints, a diversity of social backgrounds, and that can rub off on bureaucrats. So state officials that are thinking about scaling up a program, say from District A to District B, might now be more familiar with the fact that actually, after I rub shoulders with citizens who are coming from different social classes, castes, different genders, then I can begin to think that in this new district, I probably have to take those differences into account as well, and I might seek that input from those different social groups at an early stage of design, such that it doesn't fail at the kind of last mile of implementation. So if we bring those perspectives of economies and politics together, I think we'll have a more robust process. I mean, it will be time intensive, it will be resource intensive, and I do think that it's a mistake to just trim resources from the state without consideration of what makes the state work. But maybe that's the price you pay for effective public services.
Daniel, any reflections from your work on scale in the context of major programs and building single programs or having a portfolio approach?
No, this is really useful. So maybe to go back, let's just go back to the kind of the deliberative mindset versus the legalistic. So you think of deliberative as, just to recap a little bit, situated, problem-based, flexible interpretation that can handle complexity. And it's, as I said, time-consuming, but it's more socially sustainable locally, let's say. And then you think of legalistic, it's standardized, it's about upholding rules. It's often unitary and indiscriminate. I mean, by definition, there's very few exceptions to a rule. You know what I mean? So this is kind of the approach. So what's interesting underlying that, there's different growth models here. If I'm going to take a legalistic approach, I want something that's the ends are standardized. I have a kind of a similar kind of school, and I kind of grow it, either grow that school big or just kind of pound it out like almost like a mold, for fitting. What's interesting with deliberative, especially if you're thinking of it, it's really about getting, perhaps what could be scaled is the method, the approach. I'm going in, I have consultation this way, etc. And so then how you get scale, it's not so much scale, it's more about right sizing. So how do I get this kind of method in that kind of situated context? How big can it go? And then say, okay, maybe for this one in this area, it can be quite big, versus this one, there's a lot more heterogeneous, nuanced context, it's going to be small. And so then what that brings up, which is interesting, is then for the deliberative approach, how do you scale right sizing? Now, what's interesting, and you mentioned this a little bit, is that there's this tension between kind of economies of scale, or some people will call demand aggregation and the like, and then at the same time getting low enough where you can be attuned iteratively and frequently to the social situation. So then what kind of the question that comes, which is quite interesting, is to what meso level of authority of bureaucracy do you devolve authority to do that? And for some places, it could be maybe the city level. Some places it might even be at the council village level. Some cases it might be the state level. And so then it becomes an interesting discussion of what kind of level of parochialism do you devolve this to? And I think from that approach, maybe there's kind of a balance between close enough to make this iterative, but have enough of a portfolio or scale where it makes economic sense. And I'm sure for each of these may vary, but that could be the next provocation, is what meso level should I devolve this to so that I can make deliberative work in a larger end, while recognizing it's about replicating the means as opposed to whatever the end agenda may be. The school here may be different here, and it may cater to different sizes.
Okay, Khadijah, any reflections from you? I'm thinking particularly of this, balancing this tension and this notion of right sizing.
We often call it the tyranny of scale, right? Like everything we do has to go big. And of course, as we work in big programs and system level, that is the tension. And I think I completely agree. What are we trying to take to scale? Mm-hmm. And oftentimes we're constrained by, like I said before, the capacity, the resources. So it's much easier to try and cookie cutter than it is to try and deliberate and find the right thing in the right place, and to extrapolate the how and make sure that we scale that and not the what. Mm-hmm. It is much harder to do that than it is just to scale the what. So you do see a lot of cookie cutter responses being scaled and then caught out in the end for not delivering the kind of outcomes. And I think in that, the issue is, what are we measuring? How are we holding people to account? And if you're measuring, say, numbers of children, numbers of buildings built, numbers of books distributed, you're going to get cookie cutter responses. But if you're measuring something else, maybe you could get a different response. That's a very difficult argument to make. And I think one of the things I'd like to bring into this is that's a very difficult argument to make in the way that aid and support to countries is delivered. So we are bound by all of these interests, right? So if our major donor is the UK government, they put various restrictions. It's UK taxpayer money, right? They want results for that money. Absolutely right. Right. But once you get there, that could take years to get. We start off with one place and we've got to go to another to get there. That conversation is very easy to have with somebody who's on the ground with you, understands what you're going through, understands the constraints you're facing, and is willing to get into the weeds of it, but much harder back in London and Westminster to explain that and to stay with that flexibility. So the structure and the context of the way that countries are supported to make these big changes in their systems, the way that that aid money plays out is a big part of stripping out some of this complexity and forcing some cookie cutter responses onto us. The difference between the lab and the factory, get very little lab time and you got to go to the factory very quickly. That's very difficult. The other thing in this that is really interesting to me is there's big organizational nous sitting at the top of this, right? There's the ministry, there's the international development partners, there's organizations like mine, there's international NGOs. These are, well-educated, northern-based, really powerful organizations with the money. As you get downstream, the organizational nous gets less and less. And so what you're grappling with is how do you build that organizational sense, that collective action at the most marginalized, most excluded level, so that that voice is powerful. The voice of one mother is not as strong as the voice of all the women in a community, all the people in a community, all parents. And that kind of funding into building the organizations that will enable that that discussion, that dialogue to make deliberative work happen, that's very rare. And that's a real problem.
Okay, thank you. I want to open it up to all of you. Questions, reactions, comments. Yes.
I'm happy to go first, and maybe I'll start off a little bit from where Khadijah ended, because she did mention some of the work that we do in Uganda. And I think when you come to conversations like this, where they're talking about democracy, and you're thinking, oh well, I don't come from a democracy, so what does that mean for me? And I think I resonate a lot with what you've said. I come from a context where universal primary education is being implemented. And I think for us, UPE, Universal Primary Education, was introduced because it was a political promise, which then established the president as the patron of education in the country. What this also meant is, in our conversations, because we have a lot of work with communities and trying to enhance the role of the community in their children's learning, and someone referred to parents as education sleeping giants. And I think with us, with the introduction of the universal primary education, the giant went to sleep. And the reason for this was because the president said, don't worry, just send your children to school. We are taking care of everything. So the giants then thought, oh, well, I don't have to do anything. And what that means is that the political narrative around education was that parents don't have to do anything. So it sort of suffocated the ability of our local governments, who are supposed to lead on education service delivery, because we have a decentralized system, which was supposed to increase the liberation between their local governments and the communities. But then you have the president who has said, don't ask my people to make even the smallest contribution. We've had head teachers who have been arrested because somehow they asked parents to make a contribution. So I think deliberative democracy is great, and you would assume that automatically people would run for it because it is a good thing. But so I'm keen to understand from your perspective, in contexts where deliberation is not the norm, how does it arise? How do local government officials who are suffocated by the politics, how do they navigate these complexities to actually be able to deliberate with the sleeping giant and reawaken it? How would that happen in context like that?
Fantastic question, and a very difficult one. I'll try to answer it in two ways. One is, in the book, I look outside of India. So the book has certain, or the theory has certain scope conditions, and I make very clear that one of the conditions for deliberation to work is at least having the right to associate and mobilize collectively. Excuse me. So citizens need to at least have that. If it's repression through and through, the conversation is not going to get started. So I bound the argument that way, but let me try to engage it. I look at China. So China is seen as an exemplar of a unitary, uniform party state that's authoritarian. It might surprise you that China is also one of, in my view, one of the most deliberative bureaucracies that exists in the world. It's one of the most decentralized countries in the world. So fiscally and in terms of public goods at the local level, there's a lot of repression still happening. Now, it could be peculiar to the political history of China, and I think part of the answer lies in political history, and I'll get to that. But what I see in China that I don't see even as much in India is discussion across provinces and between provinces and local level to encourage experimentation. So there's a history of that, and I think that's been now pretty well established by scholars of China that actually there's kind of a system that's happening coincidentally alongside authoritarianism, which is much more about citizen participation in local level decision making. But I'll put that example aside. How do you get deliberation going in the first place? And I think that's a really hard question. And I think we have to look at the historical development of the state over time. So that's a part of my argument that's much more context specific and much more historical. And where I see it coming up is the need for politicians to work collectively with bureaucrats. So it can't be one leader. There has to be a real need to engage with someone else and cooperate. So in Himachal Pradesh, there was a lack of resources. It was politically marginal. It's a hill state, was fiscally unviable by itself. So there was a strong incentive for collective action among elites, which over time translated into discussion around policy problems. There's a need to get external resources in to the state, which you didn't see in a lot of other states that were much more politically powerful, like Uttar Pradesh. Virtually all prime ministers of India have fought elections from Uttar Pradesh and become prime ministers. Our current prime minister in India is actually fighting an election from UP, not from his home state Gujarat. It's a major state. And it's very much in the same mode of what you're describing in Uganda, where the leader actually wants to associate the policy with him or herself. And that really cuts off citizen participation. Now, the way around that, and I see what I call pockets of deliberation happening, it's a process of conflict. And that conflict will happen where some districts, you'll have some officials, and you may have some programs as well that are trying to engage community and get community support, but they're pushing back against the rest of the bureaucracy. And so I think part of it is also what Khadijah was saying. You find champions inside the state, entrepreneurial officials who are trying to encourage that kind of collective action and deliberation and support them. And this might be below the radar, and it may not be at a very large scale. And it might lead to a lot of conflict that's really tense, and there's concerns about psychological safety in that. But I think that process is probably more, you could say, incremental, and it might not fully succeed. So yeah, not a great answer, but certainly a big problem in much of the world that doesn't have that kind of free, open society and democracy.
I think this is a really big question, and I'm wondering if institutional contradiction could be your friend here. So what's interesting about this in China, what I think is fascinating about why this happens, at least in my view, if you look at their law and legislation, formally speaking, there's kind of a portion of the legislative process whereby if there's a contradiction between the province and city level, it has to go to the state council and then it has to be approved by the National People's Congress. So an example, let's say use a very mundane example. I want to attract returnees and I want to give, I don't know, 3 million yuan in this context, and the province only allows for 1 million. So there's a contradiction. And technically speaking, if the National People's Congress or the state agree with it, you can have a department that essentially circumvents the federal. Now, in the Chinese context, they don't want that out in the open. So what ends up happening is a lot of informal discussions in the background saying, oh, we're planning on doing this, could we do it? And what will sometimes happen is the province will change the regulation to account for that to do it. So it's maybe potentially interesting is if you have a situation where you can come up with a compelling reason to have a formal contradiction in institution, well, then no one wants that out in the open, especially if you're worried about the credibility of the states. So then it kind of jumpstarts an informal deliberation. And I'm wondering if that may be taking your ideas of conflict, formalizing them to then enforce informal deliberation. Might be a kind of interesting counterintuitive way to do that.
I mean, just the challenge is then when you want to formalize it in school.
Yeah, exactly.
No, and this is really hard stuff to do. There's no easy answer.
I think what you're saying is that it's deliberation, inclusion, discussion is radical. It's threatening. The reason that these systems don't work for the poorest is not an accident, right? They work for somebody else, right? And so there is a reason, there is incentive in the system to keep them not working. And that's what you're confronting when you're trying to make a system that is more inclusive. You're trying to overcome norms and practices and a system that, okay, fine, you can't say it was deliberately, I'm not like a conspiracy theorist, but that has been built over time to create these strata. So it is a radical act. And in some places, as we well know, a dangerous act. And to get around that, what we've done in certain places is to really break it down to very simple things. Parents being involved in the very simple act of supporting their children to learn, starting to scratch the surface of parents' role in education, demonstrating that that additional support, that additional engagement yields results that the state can take credit for, right? And that's a good, so you scratch my back, I'll scratch your back, and behind the scenes. And once you introduce gender into this, it gets a lot more radical and a lot more disruptive. So you have to recognize that at that core, this act is one of transformation. And that's where you're confronting the resistance.
Thanks, actually, for a great book and everybody for a great discussion. So this actually builds a little bit on where the discussion ended up just now, but I wanted to come in a slightly different place on what a plan is. So one of the insights that comes out of ethnographic qualitative work on international development is that project plans can end up being stories to give shape to messy practice, and they continually get revised as a way of making all the negotiated stuff that people do look coherent, sometimes after the fact. So if you take that as a starting point, where does that leave deliberative versus legalistic models of bureaucracy if some of what's constantly being done by institutions is telling stories about coherence, despite the fact that people do much messier, much more negotiated stuff?
Yeah, so I think one big difference is that what happens is in a deliberative fora or a deliberative bureaucracy is that messiness becomes public. It becomes it becomes open to contestation and debate and discussion. So in some sense, the process of negotiation brings out the fact that we don't have a perfect solution. We don't have the right ideas all the time. And in that process of making it public, I think another thing happens is that participants in that discussion feel a greater sense of legitimacy for what comes out of that. Because even if it's messy, I had a say in the messiness, and I can then take that messiness and try to render it meaningful for the place where I work. And sure, a plan is still coming up. I mean, it's not as if the bureaucracy in Himachal Pradesh or the other parts of India that I deem deliberative are not bureaucracies, right? They're still doing planning, they still have hierarchy, but in some sense, the messiness of the process becomes much more open and available to public scrutiny. And I think as a consequence of that, you get inputs into that planning process that renders that plan, and on paper, they can look very similar, by the way, the legalistic and deliberative plan. I mean, India has a system of 5-year planning inherited from the Soviets. And trust me, these plans read like the same. Doesn't matter where you go, it's the same plan, right? But then there's reality, which is very different. And I think in the legalistic model, these contradictions are everywhere, except they're not discussed, they're not debated, and perhaps they're being internalized, and people feel a lot, I find, feel a lot greater cognitive dissonance between what it is they're doing and what it is they're having to write down in the plans and so on, because they're not able to vocalize it as much. So I don't know if that fully gets at what you're going for in your question, but I think that's the difference.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just going to say just very briefly is that there's a point in your book that I think is addressing this, and I think it touches on what you said, Khadijah, which is that a lot of this deliberations on very mundane, trivial tasks. And it struck me as that this is potentially kind of, it's like the provocation of the mundane. Why? Because even if you have a plan that's coherent, you kind of allow it to be credible to ask points of clarification, even procedural clarification. Okay, you're saying that we have this plan of reaching, I don't know, whatever percent literacy. Okay, tell me, how do I start reading the book? How do I start? And so from that point, you're almost kind of allowing credibility to question. And then it becomes quite clear that there's difference, and it starts kind of non-intrusively, but maybe allows it that way. That kind of connects to your point where even the mundane task, even with the guise of coherence, is where really almost like the ground zero of this kind of deliberation starts, where it's very much, I just want to understand and clarify what I'm supposed to do. Yeah, which is where you got at too, which is maybe the way to attack it is that then you open it for clarification, which is kind of interesting.
Yeah, I love the idea of plans told as stories. I think that's beautiful. But what you're getting at is that storytelling breaks down, and that's what you're saying, Akshay, breaks down the sort of inaccessibility of the planning, right? If you can tell the story, if you can reveal the messiness, then you don't need, apologies, an Oxford degree to plan an education, you don't, and that's good. And so it makes it easier for a parent, a teacher to voice their opinion, because it is very intimidating in those spaces, especially when they're not open and you get these fait accompli plans coming at you, right? Unpicking that, how did we get there? What is the story that we're trying to tell is so much more generative.
Okay, we're going to take one more question, and then we will go to a reception where we can all have much more of a conversation. Yes.
So as Khadijah spoke about the technocratic solutions, and we've spoken a lot about deliberation and decentralization. So we have worked very closely with the Ministry of Women and Child Welfare back in India. So if you have to point out one, if you have to take back like one core issue and one solution that could, bring about a change, so what would that be?
For that particular ministry, or
like you just like to better the the scenario of rural India, and just to bring about that change at the grassroots level. So what would that? How would you point out that?
Yeah. So I think one it's very mundane, but one thing I would suggest is to actually have more trust in people. And when I say trust, I mean in your teachers, your frontline workers, in the citizens to whom you're delivering the policies. Knowledge does not sit only in New Delhi, nor does it sit in other state capitals. So in the case of Himachal Pradesh, in Shimla or elsewhere, in fact, there's a lot of knowledge within communities themselves. And so I would urge policymakers and planners to think about harnessing societal knowledge in the process of their work in terms of planning, but also at local level implementation. And that requires trust. I mean, so many officials I talk to say, why should I devolve decision-making down to the local level? I don't trust those people. Well, those people don't trust you either. That could very well be the problem, right? And so I think part of the issue in addressing what seem large-scale, very difficult questions that we could never tackle is just a bit of trust that actually people's intentions might be fine. We don't, and that would require maybe a degree of willing to listen. And that's the other side of deliberation. It's not just about talking, right? It's about listening to other people in the room. I would encourage every bureaucrat I know to spend some more time listening, and that might help.
Great, thanks.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to the three of you, Khadijah, Daniel, especially to Akshay for writing the book and for being in conversation. Thanks to all of you for joining. Please stay for a reception. And thank you as well to those of you joining online. We've gotten your comments and I think we've had some responses. Thank you, Jessica, for that. And thank you, Lydia and Jessica, both for organizing this wonderful event.